Hauptmann Friedrich Steiner looked up from the captured map, his face pale in the dim light of the command bunker on the French coast. "This can't be right," he murmured, tracing a meticulously marked blue line on the complex document. "Show me again where this was found." The young lieutenant who had brought the map stepped forward quickly. "At the resistance headquarters we dismantled in Calais last night during the special counter-espionage operation, Herr Hauptmann. It was carefully hidden in a secret compartment, along with these detailed technical specifications." Steiner examined the additional documents, detailed diagrams of what appeared to be an underwater piping system, with codes and markings indicating pumping points and control valves. Most disturbing was the date, August 1942, and the English annotations in the margins. "My God," Steiner finally said, turning to the semicircle of officers who were watching him anxiously. "If this is authentic, the British have built a fuel pipeline under the English Channel right under our noses. Not one, but several." An incredulous murmur swept through the room. "Impossible," declared Major Werner Heinz, commander of coastal defenses in that sector, emphatically. "Our ships, aircraft and underwater mines control the channel. No engineering project of this magnitude could occur undetected." Steiner nodded. "Yes, it would be impossible under normal wartime conditions. But this document suggests they started before the war, disguising it as commercial underwater telephone cables. And then," he pointed to specific dates and locations on the map, "they continued the work during blackouts, on moonless nights, using techniques we never considered. The possible existence of this pipeline was an alarming revelation that threatened to fundamentally undermine German assumptions about Allied logistics. If the British had indeed achieved the seemingly impossible, building a secret fuel transport infrastructure under the heavily patrolled English Channel, this could explain the RAF's mysterious ability to maintain such intense air operations despite German attacks on its fuel depots. "We need to confirm this immediately," ordered Steiner, his voice now firm with urgency. "Prepare the underwater demolition teams. These pipelines exist. We need to find them and destroy them. This could be the Achilles heel of the British war machine we've been searching for." As the room buzzed with activity, Steiner couldn't shake the uneasy feeling of awe. If the British had truly achieved such an engineering feat under such circumstances, it represented a level of ingenuity, audacity, and secrecy that defied comprehension. Unearthing the truth about this supposedly impossible oil pipeline and the race to destroy it would become one of the most extraordinary and little-known intelligence and counter-sabotage operations of World War II. In the spring of 1942, as the war reached its peak, the British High Command faced a critical dilemma that few outside the innermost circles of government knew about. The Battle of the Atlantic was at its most intense, with German submarines sinking Allied ships in alarming numbers. Convoys that managed to reach Britain brought essential supplies, but priorities were clear. Food, ammunition, and construction materials came first. Fuel, despite its fundamental strategic importance, was being transported in insufficient quantities to sustain the expanding military operations, particularly those of the Royal Air Force, whose bombers and fighters consumed immense amounts of aviation fuel. The Germans, aware of this logistical vulnerability, intensified their attacks against fuel storage facilities throughout England. The Luftwaffe had specific orders to target depots and refineries in a deliberate strategy to strangle British operational capacity. The problem was compounded by the growing need for fuel for the planned invasion of Europe. British authorities estimated that the forces that would eventually land on the continent would need thousands of tons of fuel daily, a volume that simply could not be transported by tankers through submarine-infested waters, nor properly stored on an island already overburdened and vulnerable to air attacks. It was in this desperate context that one of the most audacious and secret engineering operations of the war was conceived. The concept of an underwater pipeline crossing the English Channel seemed at first glance like a fantasy. The Channel was one of the most intensely patrolled and contested maritime areas in the world, with the French coast firmly in the hands of Nazi Germany. Any attempt at conventional construction would be immediately detected and destroyed. Furthermore, the technical challenges were immense. The strong currents, the uneven seabed, and the sheer scale of the project seemed to make it unfeasible under the circumstances of war. However, extraordinary necessity often breeds extraordinary innovation. A small group of petroleum engineers, led by the visionary Arthur Hartley, director of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, predecessor to BP, proposed a solution as ingenious as it was audacious, adapting the well-established peacetime technology for laying submarine cables to install flexible pipelines on the seabed. Hartley argued that using seemingly harmless vessels and taking advantage of specific weather conditions, pipeline sections could be installed gradually under the guise of repairs to existing telephone cables or fishing operations. The proposal was initially met with skepticism by the military. Admiral Bertram Ramsay, responsible for naval operations in the Channel, pointed out the obvious risks of detection. General Bernard Montgomery questioned whether the resources would not be better applied to more conventional solutions. It was Winston Churchill, with his well-known affinity for unorthodox projects and innovative solutions, who finally gave his crucial support to the concept. In a memorandum classified as top secret, dated January 1942, Churchill wrote, "In times of war, the seemingly impossible must not only be considered, but actively pursued when circumstances so require. If technical experts believe that such an undertaking is feasible, even marginally, we must proceed with all discretion and vigor." This endorsement from the Prime Minister gave the project, codenamed Operation Pluto, pipeline under the ocean, the political impetus needed to move forward. The most remarkable aspect of Operation Pluto was not only the audacity of the concept, but the speed with which it moved from planning to implementation. Teams of engineers and technicians were discreetly recruited, often under false pretenses. Civilian companies were engaged to produce specific components without knowledge of their final purpose. Manufacturing facilities were established in unlikely locations, such as church basements and abandoned warehouses, to avoid the attention of German bombers. The pipeline design itself represented a radical break with conventional engineering practices. Instead of traditional rigid pipes, which would have been impossible to install secretly, engineers developed CHIs, partly Anglo-Iranian Siemens, a flexible pipe based on submarine telephone cable technology. The pipe consisted of a lead core encased in multiple layers of steel and waterproofed jute, creating a structure that could be wound into enormous reels and unwound directly onto the seabed from specially adapted vessels. A second, even more innovative design was later developed. The Hamel, Hartley Mertz Lanelli, composed of steel pipe sections joined by flexible joints. This system had the advantage of being able to transport larger volumes of fuel, but presented additional installation challenges. Both designs were produced simultaneously in an extraordinary example of wartime engineering redundancy. The secrecy surrounding the operation was so rigorous that many of the workers involved in manufacturing the components had no idea of the ultimate purpose of their work. Cover stories were carefully crafted and disseminated. Official documents referred to the project only by its code name, or more frequently, using even more obscure designations such as Special Infrastructure Project or Submarine Communications Facilities. Meanwhile, on the German side of the Channel, surveillance was constant. The Kriegsmarine maintained regular patrols, supplemented by reconnaissance aircraft and an extensive network of civilian informants along the French coast. German counterintelligence, particularly the Abwehr under Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, devoted significant resources to detecting unusual activity in the Channel, focusing primarily on possible preparations for an Allied invasion of the continent. This intensive surveillance made the prospect of secretly installing an underwater pipeline all the more surprising, and for many observers, absurd. It was precisely this perception of impossibility that the British exploited. As Lord Mountbatten, then Chief of Combined Operations, observed in a confidential memo, "Sometimes the best place to hide something is in plain sight, counting on the enemy's inability to conceive that such an action would be attempted." This philosophy guided the execution of Operation Pluto from the outset, transforming what seemed to be a fatal disadvantage, intense German surveillance, into a form of psychological camouflage. The laying of the first sections of the pipeline in August 1942 was a testament to courage and ingenuity. Taking advantage of a moonless night and weather conditions that hampered German aerial surveillance, an apparently fishing vessel, the HMS Holdfast, secretly modified with specialized equipment, began laying the first high-ease pipeline between the Isle of Wight and Cherbourg. The operation was carried out in complete radio silence, with the vessel maintaining a slow and steady speed, while the pipeline was unrolled from enormous reels and laid on the seabed. In the following weeks and months, additional sections were installed, gradually extending the network. In each operation, the risks of detection were immense. On at least 2 occasions, ships involved in the project were intercepted by German patrols, surviving only thanks to the meticulous preparation of their cover stories and the presence of convincing forged documents. In another incident, A German reconnaissance plane flew over an ongoing installation operation, but apparently identified nothing suspicious, possibly interpreting the activity as routine fishing operations or maintenance of communication cables. In the autumn of 1942, the initial system was operational, discreetly transporting limited quantities of fuel from southern England to secret depots established in German-occupied territory, where it was collected by French resistance agents for use in sabotage operations. The scale was still modest, but the principle had been proven. It was possible to operate an underwater pipeline literally under the noses of the German war machine. The expansion of the system in the following months was equally remarkable for its meticulous execution. Pumping stations were disguised as ordinary agricultural facilities or air raid shelters. Junction points were hidden in seemingly abandoned structures or underground bunkers. The underground distribution network was incorporated into existing drainage systems or buried along railway lines, where any construction activity could be explained as routine infrastructure maintenance. All this extraordinary work was carried out under such effective secrecy that until early 1944, when the operation was in full swing in preparation for the imminent invasion of Normandy, only a handful of German officers had begun to suspect that something unusual might be going on. Even then, their suspicions were vague and frequently dismissed by superiors as unfounded speculation or overly imaginative interpretations of routine civilian activities. It was only in March 1944, through an extraordinary chain of coincidences and individual insight, that these suspicions began to take more concrete form in the minds of German intelligence officers in occupied France. What followed was an intense treasure hunt to confirm the existence of the impossible, an operational fuel pipeline under the English Channel, an engineering feat that, if confirmed, would represent not only an extraordinary British technical achievement, but also an embarrassing failure of German surveillance. The story of how the documents related to Operation Pluto ended up in German hands is itself a remarkable chapter of historical contingencies. In early March 1944, a French resistance cell operating near Calais was compromised after the capture and interrogation of one of its members. The subsequent German raid on the house that served as the group's operations center resulted in the seizure of numerous documents, most related to routine espionage activities, reports on troop movements, details of military installations, and information on collaborators. Among these papers, however, were several maps and technical diagrams that did not appear to be directly related to typical resistance operations. These documents were initially overlooked by the Gestapo officers in charge of the operation, who were primarily interested in dismantling the local resistance network and capturing its members. The papers were sent, along with other seized materials, for further analysis by German military intelligence. Hauptmann Friedrich Steiner, a civil engineer in pre-war life and now a technical intelligence officer assigned to the Channel coast, was tasked with examining the captured documents. Steiner possessed an unusual combination of skills. In addition to his engineering background, he had briefly worked in the German oil industry before the war and had a particularly keen eye for technical details that others might easily overlook. Upon examining the seemingly disjointed documents, Steiner noticed something that caught his attention: specifications for pipeline joints that he recognized as being similar to systems used in oil transportation. Even more intriguing were the handwritten notes in the margins, referring to depths, currents, and what appeared to be operational schedules. Piecing together these fragments of information, Steiner began to form an almost unbelievable hypothesis. These documents suggested the existence of an oil pipeline crossing the English Channel. The initial reaction from his superiors was one of understandable skepticism. Major Werner Heinz, the sector commander, pointed out the obvious. The Channel is one of the most heavily guarded waterways in the world. We have constant patrols, minefields, observation posts. How could the British build something of this magnitude without us being alerted? Captain Lieutenant Joseph Müller of Naval Intelligence was equally skeptical, suggesting that the documents could be part of an elaborate British disinformation scheme. Steiner, however, was increasingly convinced of his interpretation. He obtained permission to investigate further, beginning with a meticulous re-examination of records of unusual activity in the canal in the preceding months. What he discovered were several mentions of fishing vessels acting suspiciously and possible cable maintenance operations that had been investigated and dismissed as routine. Viewed individually, none of these occurrences seemed significant, but when Steiner mapped them chronologically and geographically, A disturbing pattern began to emerge. They didn't install this all at once, Steiner explained to his superiors in a tense briefing meeting in late March. They did it in small sections over months, disguising each operation as legitimate civilian activity, exactly the kind of approach our surveillance protocols aren't designed to detect. Steiner's argument gained further credibility when he presented an anomaly he had identified in aerial reconnaissance reports, small structures that appeared in isolated coastal locations both on the British coast and in certain areas of the French coast. Officially identified as coastal observation posts or communication installations, these structures corresponded remarkably well with what Steiner interpreted from the captured documents as potential pumping stations and control valves. Still, the evidence was circumstantial. To definitively confirm the existence of the pipeline, physical verification would be necessary. Steiner proposed a daring operation, sending teams of elite Kriegsmarine divers to examine the seabed at specific locations where documents suggested the pipeline might be located. The proposal was approved, but with low priority, a reflection of his superiors' continued distrust of the plausibility of the entire theory. The first verification mission was launched in difficult weather conditions in early April 1944. A small patrol boat, disguised as a fishing vessel to avoid attracting undue attention from the British, transported a team of 3 specialist divers to a point approximately halfway between Dover and Calais. The underwater conditions were challenging: limited visibility, strong currents, and the constant risk of undetected mines. After several hours of methodical searching, the leader of the diving team, Oberfeldwebel Kurt Lehmann, emerged with surprising news. They had located what appeared to be, undoubtedly, an unusually designed oil pipeline, semi-buried in the seabed. A small section was photographed, and a sample of the outer coating was collected before deteriorating conditions forced the operation to be terminated. The confirmation of the pipeline's existence, even if only in one location, triggered a series of urgent actions. Steiner was immediately summoned to the German High Command headquarters in Saint-Germain, on the outskirts of Paris, where he presented his findings directly to General Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief in the West. The revelation was met with a mixture of disbelief and alarm. The strategic significance was obvious. If the British had solved their fuel supply problem through this ingenious underwater solution, it had significant implications for their ability to sustain intensive air operations and, potentially, for their plans to invade the continent. This must be neutralized immediately, ordered von Rundstedt. Mobilize the necessary resources and coordinate with the Kriegsmarine. I want every inch of this pipeline located and destroyed. The urgency was palpable, as there were growing signs of Allied preparations for a major operation. What the Germans correctly suspected was the imminent invasion of northern France. In the days that followed, additional teams of divers were mobilized, and vessels equipped with primitive but effective sonar were assigned to map the pipeline's course. What they discovered exceeded even Steiner's suspicions. It wasn't a single pipeline, but a developing network, with multiple lines at different stages of installation. Some sections appeared operational, while others were still under construction. The Luftwaffe was instructed to redouble its vigilance for unusual activity in the channel, with particular focus on vessels that might be involved in the installation or maintenance of oil pipelines. Reports began to accumulate, painting a picture of a British operation far more extensive than initially imagined. What had begun as an investigation of documents captured by chance had transformed into one of the greatest concerns of the German military command in occupied France. For Steiner, whose suspicions were so dramatically confirmed, the discovery represented a remarkable professional achievement, but it also raised a disturbing question. How long had this British operation gone unnoticed, and what other secret Allied initiatives might have been underway without German knowledge? In his personal diary, he wrote, "We became so focused on looking for the obvious, large convoys, substantial naval activity, conventional invasion preparations, that we failed to notice the extraordinary gradually unfolding before our eyes, a lesson I hope we will not forget." The German response to the discovery of the underwater pipeline was immediate and energetic, but also complicated by several operational and strategic factors. The first challenge was determining the full extent of the system. Initial underwater reconnaissance missions had confirmed the pipeline's existence in several locations, but mapping its complete route was extremely difficult under the conditions of the channel. Strong currents, often limited visibility, and the ever-present risk of mines made the work of German divers dangerous and slow. The Kriegsmarine mobilized additional resources, including vessels equipped with magnetic detection devices adapted to locate large metallic objects on the seabed. These vessels began patrolling methodical search patterns, attempting to trace the pipeline's complete course. The process was complicated by the fact that significant portions of the system had been carefully buried in the seabed sediment, reducing its magnetic signature. Alongside these mapping efforts, underwater demolition teams began preparing to destroy the pipeline. Led by Kapitän-Leutnant Helmut Weber, an expert in underwater demolition, these teams faced a considerable technical challenge. The pipeline was not a conventional structure. Its flexible and reinforced construction, designed to withstand the harsh conditions of the channel, also made it resistant to traditional methods of sabotage. The first attempts at rupture, using standard explosive charges, produced disappointing results. The damage caused was limited, and the affected sections could apparently be repaired with relative ease by British maintenance teams. Weber and his team were forced to quickly develop new methods and explosive devices specifically adapted to the task. Their experiments resulted in a specialized directional charge nicknamed the Krebsschere, crab claw, designed to compress and completely rupture the pipeline, making repair much more difficult. Meanwhile, German intelligence intensified its efforts to uncover more details about the British operation. Agents infiltrated the south coast of England, received specific orders to report any activity that might be related to the land-based infrastructure of the pipeline system. The Luftwaffe increased its photographic reconnaissance missions over potential British coastal installations, although these missions were becoming increasingly dangerous due to growing Allied air superiority. One particularly frustrating aspect for the Germans was the apparent British ability to quickly repair damaged sections of the pipeline. On more than one occasion, a section that had been confirmed as destroyed by a German demolition team appeared to be operational again within days. This suggested to the Germans that the British possessed dedicated repair teams on constant alert, capable of responding rapidly to disruptions, another indication of the strategic importance the Allies attached to the system. In mid-May 1944, after several weeks of intense activity, the Germans had managed to map approximately 60% of what they believed to be the complete pipeline network and had conducted sabotage operations against multiple segments. However, the effectiveness of these operations was difficult to assess. Aerial reconnaissance analyses and agent reports suggested that, despite the damage inflicted, the system as a whole remained operational, transporting significant quantities of fuel to depots on the British coast. Steiner, whose initial investigation had triggered the entire operation, expressed growing frustration with the situation. In a memo to General Heinz, he wrote, "We are fighting an asymmetrical battle. The British can build and repair faster than we can locate and destroy. Each section we neutralize represents only a small percentage of the system's total capacity. We need a more strategic approach." This more strategic approach began to take shape in the following weeks, when German intelligence managed to identify what appeared to be one of the main pumping stations on the British side, disguised as an agricultural installation near Dungeness. The Luftwaffe planned a precision bombing mission, using its precision strike squadron equipped with Fritz X guided bombs, one of the first smart weapons in military history. The mission, conducted on the night of May 27th by a small formation of Dornier Do 217 bombers, succeeded in hitting the facility, causing significant damage, as confirmed by photographic reconnaissance the following day. Subsequent German analysis suggested that this attack had managed to reduce the operational capacity of the pipeline system by approximately 30%, the largest single impact achieved up to that point. However, time was running out for the German efforts. On June 6, 1944, the Allies launched Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. Immediately, German military priorities shifted drastically, with all available resources being redirected to containing the invasion. Operations against the Channel pipeline, while not completely abandoned, were significantly reduced in scale and intensity. In the following months, as Allied forces advanced through northern France, the Germans gradually lost access to the coastal areas of the Channel from where they had conducted their operations against the pipeline. By around September 1944, with the liberation of Calais and other coastal towns, the campaign against the Pluto effectively ended, not through a decisive resolution, but simply through the evolution of the broader strategic situation. For the British, The German discovery of their secret pipeline represented a significant but not catastrophic challenge. The distributed and redundant nature of the Pluto system meant that damage to individual sections, while problematic, did not compromise the operation as a whole. Furthermore, by mid-1944, the system had already fulfilled much of its initial purpose, supplying the RAF during the critical phase of the air war. With the successful Normandy invasion and the establishment of secure beachheads, more conventional methods of fuel transport became viable, reducing the exclusive reliance on the underwater pipeline. What the Germans never fully discovered was the full scale of Operation Pluto. The captured documents that initiated Steiner's investigation mainly related to the initial lines installed in 1942-43. By 1944, the system had expanded considerably, with additional lines being installed regularly, some using the more advanced Hamel design. In reality, the German sabotage operations, while annoying, never seriously compromised the overall capability of the system. In the end, the race between German discovery and destruction versus British expansion and repair was won by the British. As Allied forces advanced across Europe in 1944-45, the Pluto network was extended further, eventually reaching liberated France and supplying the vital fuel that powered the Allied advance into Germany. By the time of the German surrender in May 1945, 17 separate pipelines crisscrossed the Channel, carrying over 1 million gallons of fuel daily to Allied forces on the continent. The story of the German race to discover and destroy the impossible British oil pipeline under the Channel remained largely unknown for decades after the war. Many of the documents relating to the German efforts were destroyed during the chaotic retreat of 1944, or lost in the general confusion of the collapse of the Third Reich. On the British side, Operation Pluto remained classified until the 1960s, with many specific operational details, including clashes with German sabotage teams, being released only decades later. For Friedrich Steiner, whose insight and perseverance initiated the German hunt for the pipeline, the outcome was bittersweet. His success in uncovering the secret British operation earned him recognition within German intelligence circles, but the inability to effectively neutralize the threat also highlighted the growing limitations of German resources in the final period of the war. Steiner survived the conflict and, in a remarkable twist of fate, ended up working in the post-war oil industry, where he occasionally met former British adversaries at technical conferences, though they rarely discussed their respective roles in the secret drama that had unfolded beneath the waters of the Channel. The technical and strategic consequences of Operation Pluto and the subsequent German attempt to neutralize it extended far beyond the Second World War. For the British, the project demonstrated the feasibility of long-distance submarine pipelines in challenging conditions, a lesson that would significantly influence the subsequent development of global energy infrastructure. Many of the technical innovations developed for Pluto, particularly those related to flexible, pressure-resistant materials and submarine laying techniques, found applications in the burgeoning offshore oil and gas industry in the following decades. For the Germans, the experience highlighted critical flaws in their surveillance and counterintelligence protocols. The British ability to conduct an engineering operation of such magnitude literally under the noses of the German occupation represented a significant failure of detection and assessment. The lessons of this episode were studied extensively by post-war intelligence services, particularly in relation to the detection of gradual adversary operations, those that progress in such small increments that they can escape conventional detection. Perhaps the most lasting legacy of this extraordinary story is the demonstration of the power of technical ingenuity and operational adaptability in times of extreme pressure. In an era of ubiquitous surveillance and sophisticated sensors, the idea that a critical infrastructure operation could be conducted secretly on one of the world's most closely watched waterways seems almost inconceivable. However, the British success and subsequent German investigation illustrate an enduring truth. Even the most advanced technologies and methodologies are filtered through human perception and institutional assumptions, creating possibilities for the seemingly impossible to be achieved by those bold and innovative enough to try. In modern strategic analyses, Operation Pluto and the German race to destroy it are frequently cited as a classic example of what military theorists call asymmetric innovation, the ability to circumvent an adversary's conventional advantages through unorthodox approaches. The British, facing German control of the Channel, did not attempt to challenge this superiority directly, but developed a solution, that exploited specific gaps in German detection and interdiction capabilities. The Germans, in turn, were forced to adapt their existing tactics and technologies to confront a threat they had not anticipated. This pattern of innovation, counter-detection, adaptation, and counter-adaptation continues to characterize contemporary strategic confrontations from conventional conflicts to the cyber realm. As such, the study of this relatively obscure episode of World War II continues to offer valuable insights for current military planners and security strategists. When the documents relating to the German investigation of the Pluto pipeline were finally declassified and made available to historians, they revealed the degree of reluctant admiration that Steiner and his colleagues had for British ingenuity. In an evaluation report prepared for his superiors in August 1944, when the battle for the pipeline was effectively lost, Steiner wrote, "We must acknowledge that we were outmatched not by superior resources or strength, but by technical imagination and operational audacity. The adversary identified a critical need, devised a solution that we considered impossible, and executed it literally before our eyes. This is perhaps the most dangerous form of superiority." Today, more than 7 decades after these events, few physical traces of Operation Pluto or the German efforts to neutralize it remain visible. Occasionally, fishermen in the channel still snag their nets on buried sections of pipeline, and divers sometimes find the remnants of failed-to-detonate Krebs-shear explosive charges. On the coast, some of the pumping installations have survived, converted for other uses, their history known only to local historians and enthusiasts. However, the intangible legacy of this story, the lessons about innovation, adaptability, and the power of human determination, remains relevant. In a world increasingly dominated by comprehensive surveillance systems and sophisticated detection capabilities, the episode of the impossible pipeline and the race to destroy it serves as a reminder that human ingenuity often finds its way through seemingly impenetrable barriers. For every measure, there is a countermeasure. For every detection strategy, corresponding evasion technique. For young engineers and strategists studying this episode today, the essential lesson remains clear. The most significant limitations are rarely technical or material, but conceptual. It was the Germans' inability to conceive that such a project would be attempted that allowed its initial success. It was the British refusal to accept the apparent logistical impossibilities that made Pluto possible. As Winston Churchill himself observed in his post-war memoirs, Operation Pluto represents not only a triumph of engineering, but of imagination applied to the most extreme necessity. This interaction between imagination, necessity, and technical application continues to shape the evolution of military technology and national security strategy. While new challenges emerge in domains that Churchill and Steiner could scarcely have imagined, from deep space to cyberspace, the story of the pipeline under the Channel and the race to uncover it remains a valuable case study on the perennial nature of innovation under pressure and the clash of determined minds in conditions of extreme conflict. As a final note on this remarkable story, it is important to observe that both Operation Pluto and the German efforts to neutralize it were, to a large extent, conducted by civilians recruited for military service. Engineers, technicians, and specialists whose knowledge and skills were redirected from peaceful development to the requirements of total war. In the post-war period, many of those involved returned to their civilian careers, applying the lessons and innovations developed during the conflict to improve energy infrastructure, communication systems, and other technologies that benefited society as a whole. For historians of technology, Operation Pluto represents a fascinating case study of innovation under pressure. The circumstances of war forced British engineers to develop solutions that, in peacetime, would likely have taken years to conceive and implement. Compressing this development cycle into mere months under conditions of extraordinary secrecy produced technological advances with far-reaching applications in the post-war world. The first German flights against the British in the Channel represent an equally interesting chapter in the evolution of counter-sabotage operations. The techniques developed by Steiner's team to locate, map, and attack critical underwater infrastructure established precedents that would influence military doctrines for generations. Ultimately, both the pipeline and the efforts to destroy it reflect a fundamental principle of human conflict throughout modern history. The constant and intricate competition between protection and penetration, secrecy and discovery, strategic innovation and tactical counter-innovation. It is a perpetual and fascinating cycle that continues to define the battlefields of the 21st century.